Welcome to this conference about Russia's direction, Putin's objectives and the European response, which I think is a very important subject to discuss, perhaps the most important subject to discuss in Europe at this moment, even if there are other also very important subjects. But I still think this is a very crucial issue for Europe. Could I first say a few words about Jarl Hjalmarson Foundation? It's a foundation close to the Moderate Party, been there since the early 90s. And of course it started in a time when Europe looked finally as a possibility to open its border, to enlarge, to create freedom of movement, to create openness in the whole continent. A fantastic time after the end of the Cold War. And the idea of the Jarl Hjalmarson Foundation was, of course, to see that we from the Swedish side, particularly, of course, our party, but there were also similar foundations started by the other Swedish parties, to work with the nascent political forces, particularly in Central Eastern Europe. And of course, from a Swedish perspective, we started with the three Baltic countries. And I dare to say that we were part of helping and supporting and forming the democratic structures and the democratic institutions in these three countries, sometimes with a rather heavy involvement in that. And I think that was a very important support when you go from dictatorship into democracy. We also focused a lot on Russia. Russia is in a way a neighbor to Sweden. If you look that into the Bay of Finland, there is the old Swedish territory of St. Petersburg. And it was natural, of course, for us to engage very much with Russia. We have high hopes of Russia at that time. There were people like Gaidar, Boris Nemtsov were the two that we first worked with, and the Eurasia was one of the party changed name several times, but we worked a lot with them. And I can say during the 1990s, I don't know how many times I spent in the Russian Duma and around in Russia in different conferences, trying help and support to build in the same way democratic structures and democratic parties. Because democratic parties are very important. That's the essential part of building a democratic structure. It was a fascinating time. Russia is a big country. And it was Boris Yeltsin time, which means it was not always very orderly, a bit chaotic, if I put it that way. We didn't always know whether the president was sober or not, but it was moving, chaotic and moving, and we have rather high hopes. The thinking in Europe was, of course, that we should spread our values, our system. That was the whole thinking. We took that for granted. The market economy, democracy, and low corruption, etc. We should spread that, first of all, to the east, maybe also to the south. But going to the east, we were extremely successful, I would say, from Tallinn to Sofia. Perhaps one of the most successful periods in human history. The process from dictatorship, occupation, into membership in the European Union, Council of Europe, NATO, within more or less 12 years. I think that is one of the fastest developments in human history. That made us perhaps a bit over-optimistic, if I put that. We had another part of Europe that started with war, Western Balkans or Yugoslavia, the Yugoslav wars. There everything went wrong to start with. But after a while, particularly with the help of the Americans, that area went in more or less into the same direction, if still there are some problems, to put it mildly, in that region. But nevertheless, to the easternmost Europe, Russia and the 6 countries around it, that was, we started, I would say, rather good. But then, of course, came the backlashes. Democracy that we thought should come eventually, knowing the problems, but nevertheless, came into reverse. Also the economy that opened up and became more and more, should I say, market economy-like in some of the countries, not all of them. Belarus never really left the old command system. But otherwise, that also became coming into reverse. And when thinking back to this, I think that there are two things that were rather crucial. One was 2004, after the election of Putin, or he was appointed really, the last day of the last millennium, the 31st of December 1999, if you remember. But then also re-elected as president. That I think was the oil price. I was in the Parliamentary Assembly of the NATO for a long time, for 10 years. And the biggest delegation in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly was a Russian delegation. That was very fashionable in Russia, in the Duma, to be part of the NATO delegation. That was a real thing, to be in the NATO delegation. So the biggest delegation, even bigger than the Americans, because only half the Americans attend. They have difficulty to leaving the hill. And that was a discussion in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. When should Russia become member of NATO? That was really the debate, again and again and again. The dominant theme, I would say, up to the early 2000s. Again, the change, I think, was the oil price. I don't know it for sure, but I know some people who were close to Putin at the early time, when he was more or less the successor of Yeltsin, saying that he started to think new thoughts when it was manna from heaven, or rather money from the ground. And Gazprom became a vehicle, not only for selling gas, but also a vehicle for geopolitical ambitions, if I put it that way, an instrument of power. And it was interesting, very interesting, to be in the Duma up to the Duma election 2003, was it? Yes, 2003. You had interesting people, a lot of people that wish Russia to be part of Europe, to be part of the West, etc. Interesting debates, interesting people. But the Duma election 2003 was the first sign that the oppression, or should I say, the tightening of the thinking came. But still there were a few interesting people in the Duma after the 2003 election. They all disappeared 2007 Duma election. Then it was no one really that had any idea apart from earning more money for himself, in a few cases for herself, but no idea of reforming the country or whatever. So my thinking, though, is that it was a tragedy really what happened in Russia in the early years of 2000, when instead of going in the direction of Central Eastern Europe, Russia chose another way. It's not for me then to describe that in a deeper, that is for the panel now to explain to us Putin's geopolitical objectives and its consequences, which is a very demanding title, but we have extremely talented people here who will help us with sorting this out. It's Olga Shorina. She's the executive director of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation. Could I also say that Boris Nemtsov, of course, was the one who we liaised with later on when he came, even if I met him first when I guess he was mayor of Nizhny Novgorod, yeah. Governor, yeah. He even asked if you could privatize the street. I remember that. I was a bit astonished, I must say. If you're a neoliberal and get that question, you say. But he certainly has been the one who has been very close to us during the later years. Then, of course, Stephen Nix from the International Republican Institute, based in Washington, D.C., but traveling more in the east than in the Washington area, I guess. Yes. You can meet him in airports whenever you go to the Kiev or whatever. And what he doesn't know about that area is not well worth knowing. Then we have a particular point of view, the Åland Islands. There Olof Ehrenkrona, who is a Consul General there, but he has a background in the moderate party as a close collaborator with Carl Bildt, who has, of course, been very instrumental when it comes to the moderate party, former party leader and foreign minister. So he will also give his perspectives. By that, we move into the subject itself. Olga, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for the organization of such a meeting. And thank you very much for you still have hopes for Russia. That's very important for us. You know, since I left Russia this September, Putin's image in Europe has changed. Russian bombings in Syria seem to return Putin to the round table of global leaders. And yesterday and today we have a lot of such opinions in press, in the media, and we even have some shocking statements that USA and Europe should to learn how to treat terrorists by Russian experience in Chechnya. I'm sure it is not a sound approach at all. It became possible after these terrible attacks in Paris. And this week we could also observe how fast Putin's propaganda machine can turn over just in a few days. All these propagandists have forgotten how they criticized Paris for Charlie Hebdo and how they criticized the US for everything. And they have forgotten how for 17 days they tried to argue about the technical version of the Boeing crash in Egypt. They called it an accident where 2,024 Russians died. I regret that Russian society, with its long history and cultural development, is being so easily manipulated and has become such aggressive. But that is the result of everyday brainwashing, which costs $1.5 billion of the Russian budget. At the same time, Putin's agenda hasn't changed a lot. Crimea is still annexed. Some occasional shootings in Donbass are taking place right now. And Minsk agreements are still far from its realization. The idea of the Russian world, Ruski Mir, has not been removed from the agenda. And we have new evidences of close but not altruistic friendship between Putin's regime and some European ultra-left and ultra-right parties and movements. Putin's frankly outspoken objectives haven't been changed. He spoke about new global security system. He spoke about multipolarity. He spoke about new Helsinki agreement, Helsinki II, and he spoke about specific Russian character which has to be factored. And so that is Putin's position. Syria and global terrorism have become just another playing card for Putin. Unpredictability in Russia is rising, and that is the organic part of all authoritarian and dictator regime. Isolationism inside Russia is increasing. Just the latest news. The new law, which is going to be adopted by the State Duma, will let the Russian Constitutional Court cancel all the decision of international courts inside Russia. We see that the war party in Kremlin and in Russian TV is ruling. The high level of hatred is keeping inside the country. Last week it was against the USA and Europe. Now it is directed against terrorism. But the permanent enemy for Putin's regime is Russian opposition. And I'm sure Putin is very excited by François Hollande's speech this week, especially that part about the need of constitutional changes for the fight against terrorism. We had the same after Beslan tragedy, when Putin cancelled regional governors' elections. The Russian society, unfortunately, is an innocent and injured party. Its opinion doesn't interest Putin at all. Yes, the majority supports the regime, but it is a very temporary substance. I would like to demonstrate it one example. Before Russia has started this operation in Syria, sociologists from Revada Center asked Russians what do they think about participation of Russian troops in Syria conflict. And only 14% of respondents were for it. Just 10 days later, with all this TV activity, Russians' attitudes changed dramatically. 47% of respondents said that they support Russian bombings. It was just 10 days. And back then and still now, hardly the third part of Russians can show Syria on a map. This passivity can be opposed only by permanent and long-term work, by supporting those who continue the fight for democratic ideas and values. And the European way is inevitable for Russia. That is what Boris Nemtsov believed in. And his life was dedicated for enlightenment, advocacy for people's rights and freedoms, including the freedom of information. And he was always promoting the European values inside Russia. And these are the goals of Boris Nemtsov Foundation, which I am honored to represent here. I would like to finish my speech by speaking in support of imposing sanctions, international individual sanctions, on high-ranking Russian state media managers and TV employees who are responsible for this environment of hatred in Russia and who are responsible for incitement against Boris Nemtsov. The list of 8 propagandists were announced after Boris Nemtsov assassination by his colleagues Mikhail Kasyanov and Vladimir Karamurza, and this list was supported by Boris' daughter, Zhanna Nemtsova, who is the founder of Boris Nemtsov Foundation. All these people who are always accusing opposition, accusing USA and Europe like enemies, they like to spend their vacations and their money in Europe. And they are afraid of losing this comfort. And I believe that individual sanctions will demonstrate that it is absolutely unacceptable to be propagandist and produce aggression and hatred inside their own country and be treated as a journalist and a valuable person in free democratic states. Let them do so means to support Russian propaganda. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Olga Shorina, for this presentation. I think it's important for us to understand how life is in Russia, in Moscow, and among the elite. And I think we have to come back to that, what you said at the end about the measures that will be our second part of the conference, what we in Europe or the West should do. But thank you for giving us a bit of nudging into that direction. By that, Stephen Nix, now you are in the limelight.
Thank you, Göran. Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today to talk about this topic. I've been doing presentations throughout Eastern and Western Europe, and it's amazing the level of interest that exists in Russia, Putin, and the threat that it poses in the modern world. I'd like to start by thanking the Hjalmarson Foundation for sponsoring this event and just go on the record as saying IRI, which is a democracy-building organization. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, we're based in Washington, D.C. We work in over 60 countries throughout the world. We were established by President Ronald Reagan and have been chaired for the past 18 years by Senator John McCain. And IRI is very pleased to have developed a very strong partnership with the Hjalmarson Foundation over the years. And someone reminded me today that there are actually 4 events taking place in various parts of the world where IRI and Hjalmarson Foundation are cooperating. And so I want to thank Eva Gustafsson for developing this relationship and her staff and for inviting me here today to speak to you. I want to talk about Putin's geopolitical objectives and their consequences. And I'm going to start by making the opening statement that the invasion of the Donbass, the annexation of Crimea, has certainly upended the world order such as it was established at the end of the Second World War. But it's not limited to Ukraine. Putin's ambitions go far beyond just Ukraine. We've seen the development of what was once called the Customs Union, which is now morphed into the Eurasia Union. We call it an economic union with a mask of a political union, because that's what it's developing into. If you look at this first slide, you can see that the former republics are the primary goals of Putin's customs union, his Eurasian Union. If you look to the left, the countries that are already in, we can add to that, because Kyrgyzstan's president just signed into law a parliamentary act which makes Kyrgyzstan now a member of the customs union. So the union is growing, and we expect that efforts will continue to expand the union. Putin made it very clear at the time that he invaded Ukraine that Russia invoked the right to intervene anywhere in order to protect the rights of Russian speakers. Not Russian citizens, not ethnic Russians, Russian speakers. That could apply to any country pictured in this map, including 3 countries that are members of NATO. So he's made it very clear what his intentions are. But he's gone beyond the customs union, obviously. And in Ukraine, he's utilized what we call hybrid warfare. The invasion of Ukraine was not a traditional military invasion. It invoked a number of different utilities that have been used to great effect. Some of them are listed here. But if you look through the list, special forces, irregular forces, local unrest, information, propaganda, diplomacy, every one of these components were utilized in Ukraine. And this is the type of warfare that we see as the biggest threat in the future. Putin is not content to merely be involved in the former Soviet republics. His eyes are on Europe. And you can see that he's invested heavily in both leftist parties in Europe and right-wing parties in Europe. There's a sense of tradition that apparently binds leftist parties to the old Soviet Union, and now we see right-wing parties that have openly admitted they've received loans and actually direct contributions from the Russian Federation. So Putin is definitely trying to intervene, interfere, and affect political decisions being made here in Europe. A lot of this is done through Russian propaganda. I'll point to Russia Today, but Sputnik and others are hard at work to spread propaganda. Although it pretends to be a news agency, Russia Today doesn't dispense with news. If you look at the content, very little is said about Russia. Russia Today broadcasts primarily about the United States and Europe. And its intent is not to provide news about us, but to spread confusion, disorder, and indecision with chorny propaganda, black PR. And I'll point to one of the great examples of Russian propaganda, and this was used in Ukraine. If you know anything about Ukrainian or Russian iconography, heaven is pictured on the right on icons, and purgatory or hell is pictured on the left. This was used extensively during the referendum on Crimea and the annexation there, and also the military invasion of the Donbass. So you'll see at the right, Russia is portrayed to Ukraine. That's a Ukrainian Cossack in the middle. Looking to the right, where Russian culture, science achievements, religion, family values are portrayed. And then if you look to the west, you see an immoral, decaying, decadent West. And there are other ways that Western leaders are portrayed. And Putin and the Russia propaganda machine have made an art form out of describing anyone who opposes them as Nazis, as fascisti. So if you disagree with Putin, if you disagree with Russia, somehow that transforms you into a fascist or a Nazi. Another propaganda endeavor is to glorify the Soviet Union, glorify its leaders, pay tribute to Stalin, and it is having a surprising effect. If you look at Levadia Center polling today, it shows that young people actually have a net positive perception of Joseph Stalin. So this education, and particularly in its effect on young people, is affecting the way that Russians view themselves and view their place in the world, and most importantly, view their history. I'll go back to the Crimean Referendum again and this portrayal of Nazism. This is a billboard in Simferopol portraying Election Day, the referendum on Crimean annexation into Russia, a stark choice. On the 16th of March, you choose Nazism in Crimea or Russia. And then the last piece of propaganda, last slide I would like to share with you, is this sign was posted throughout Moscow on Victory Day. And what it reads is, Сегодня Крым, завтра Рим, which translates into, today Crimea, tomorrow Rome. And I think that speaks volumes about Putin's ultimate goals and what he's trying to achieve, not just in the former Soviet Union, but in Eastern and Western Europe. Real quickly, because Göran says I only have 10 minutes to talk about Russia. Second component of Putin's war is the war that he's waging on democracy within his own country. And these are the obstacles that Olga and Ilya, which you'll hear more about, will describe to you. But I just wanted to, as a lawyer, I just wanted to make sure you understood what Putin is doing at home and doing legislatively to destroy democracy and the opposition in his own country. He's using Duma-adopted laws to eliminating political opposition. And he's done it in 3 basic statutes. Number 1 is the Foreign Agents Law, the Undesirable Organizations Law, and the Municipal Filters Law. Foreign Agent Law very quickly basically made it a requirement that if a Russian NGO received any financial assistance from a foreign organization, that Russian organization was required to register with the government as a foreign agent. And as you can imagine, the connotation of being labeled a foreign agent is a very negative one, and one that painted a very undesirable depiction of the Russian NGOs that were fighting for democracy and freedom and human rights. So a lot of the Russian NGOs, after this law was adopted, chose to change their legal status from an NGO, a tax-exempt, a 501c3, we would say in the United States, to a corporate entity. And that made them, how to put this, that enabled them to avoid registering as foreign agents. But as a result, Putin then had the Duma adopt what he calls the Undesirable Organization Law. So the noose really became tightened on Ilya and Olga and others who were fighting for democracy, because this law basically states that in the event that the Minister of Justice and the Procuratura decide that an international organization poses a constitutional threat to Russia's security, it can be declared an undesirable organization. And in doing so, 3 things happen. Number 1, the Procuratura has the right to seize all that organization's assets in Russia, seize its property, freeze its bank accounts. And third, and most importantly, it enables them to begin criminal prosecution, criminal proceedings against any Russian citizens who are employed by that organization. So far, there's only been one organization that's been deemed undesirable in Russia, and that's the National Endowment for Democracy. However, a list has been prepared of organizations that will be declared undesirable. Izvestia reported today that IRI and others will attain this status of undesirable sometime in December. So we expect to be declared undesirable. I'm sure our chairman, Senator John McCain, will take that as a point of pride that we're doing the right thing in being declared undesirable in Russia. But that will not stop us from continuing our work there. And then finally, real briefly, we thought we had achieved a great victory after the protests in Moscow, after the flawed parliamentary elections 5 years ago. One of the concessions the Kremlin made was direct election of governors, which had heretofore been appointed by Putin himself. Great victory, but this law was adopted, which totally waters down the ability for the opposition to elect governors. There's tremendous procedural requirements in terms of signature collection, and then finally it gives the president the right basically to fire any governor that the president deems appropriate, whether that's corruption or other charges. So even if you did survive all these procedural hurdles, manage to elect an independent governor, that governor can be replaced at the whim of the president, and it's not appealable. And then finally, I just want to spend 1 minute about the democratic forces of Russia. I think it's an important message, and you'll hear more from Ilya about this. There is a Russian opposition. It's united, it's functional, it has a strategy, and it's focused right now on Duma elections will take place in less than a year. They've targeted certain areas for election. Russia has returned to a mixed system where half of the seats are single mandate, half are party list. The opposition has a strategy of having a single list of candidates in the single mandate seats and a coordinated strategy working together in the party list seats. So it's important for people to understand that the Russian opposition is functional, they have a program, they have a strategy, and they're working together, and they deserve our support. And that's really what I wanted to end with. In terms of the information war, the West has to, again, rededicate itself to pushing back and provide alternatives to what people are seeing in Europe and the United States in terms of Russian propaganda. We've got to take steps to stop funding political parties here in Western Europe that support Putin's regime. And then in terms of Russian legislation, the biggest issue with this legislation is that it's being copied. And so you can see draft laws being prepared in the parliaments of Egypt and in China that mirror the same restrictions that Russia is developing. And the fear is this will go beyond Central Asia, where some states have already adopted these laws, but will elsewhere in Asia, in Africa, even South America. So, in sum, I'd like to appeal to Sweden and all of our other allies to support the Russian opposition in these Duma elections, to help them train candidates, to train political parties to effectively compete in these elections in the hope that we could finally, after many, many years, have a pro-Western voice in the Russia Duma. Thank you, and I'll take your questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for giving us a thorough background to what's happening right now in Russia. Thank you very much. Olof, Ehrenkrona,
Thank you.
You have the floor. Sir.
Thank you. I think it's important to understand that we need to understand. I don't think we have an totally adequate picture of what are the roots of the Russian problem today, and I think that we need to have this, see this in its historical context and in its political context and in its economical context. In my view, there are certain ideas, certain perceptions, and certain frames of references in Kremlin that are actually guiding the politics and policies of Putin and the setup, his setup in Kremlin. You can study what has been said officially in the Munich conferences, in the Valdai conferences, in the Crimea speech, and you get a fairly coherent picture of the ideas and the perceptions that are the guidelines for Kremlin's policies. The first very important part of the analysis must start with how does Mr. Putin and how do the Kremlin officials perceive the world around them. It's not a peaceful world. It's a world of antagonistic relationships. And the antagonistic relationships must lead to consequences for the Russian policies. This is one of the most fundamental parts of the analysis that is done in Kremlin. It's a clash of civilizations, where the Russian civilization, in the minds of Putin and Alexander Dugin, who is one of the inspirers, with the Russian civilization is an entity of its own. It's not West, it's not Asian, it's Russian. And it's based in the roots of the clash between the Roman and the East and West Rome, basically. This clash of civilization will not have any peaceful conclusion. You can have, it's a state of a permanent conflict, and no peaceful peaceful coexistence is not in the long run possible with the liberal democracies, because the fundamental base, the base for the Russian entity is that it is non-liberal. In the same moment that they accept some of the liberal premises, then you get a number of things that is absolutely not compatible with the Russian civilization. Already in the his Munich speech 2007, Putin foresaw the breakdown of non-proliferation treaties, and we have seen this gradually happens ever since. And the latest sign was, of course, the telegram that we got the other day about the torpedo with nukes. It was an accident that it was published by Russian media, but it's definitely worrisome. The second part of this analysis is the homemade, I would say, Versailles trauma. If one look carefully on the Russian or the Kremlin analysis, you can see that the concept of Helsinki Agreement has been more or less gone totally. The invasion of Ukraine was the most flagrant example, but the Helsinki Treaty has 10 elements. Russia violated every single one of them. Every single one of the Helsinki Treaty was violated when the invasion in Ukraine. If you look and if you listen to what is said about the revival of the revision of the Helsinki Treaty, what is the ambition, the long-term ambition and the short-term ambition of Russia is to get rid of the third basket. And we remember that the third basket was the poison pill that was introduced in the post-war European order, and it was what in the long run actually led to what in Putin's mind has been the biggest geopolitical catastrophe in Europe or in the world since the Second World War. And of course, now he wants to get rid of the third basket, and he wants to move the situation back to the order that was present in Yalta. And we know how he guided Berlusconi. We saw how he guided Berlusconi in the rooms of Yalta and where Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt made up the post-war order. This is the ideal geopolitical ambition that I would say that Putin has.
Could I just explain? Third basket is democracy and human rights.
Yeah, third basket is democracy and human rights and the free flow of people and ideas. To achieve this, and this is also an important aspect of this, Putin and Kremlin does not overstate the strength of Russia. They look upon Russia as a rather weak part here. So in this conflict, in the antagonistic relationship with the West, Russia is the underdog. In order to make things more equal, you need to form a coalition of authoritarian, anti-Western. And we have seen the Sino-Russian relationship, that is an important aspect of this, but we have also seen them trying to work with the BRICS, and BRICS has not been a success story. The Sino-Russian is, I would say from a Russian domestic policy point of view, a double-edged sword, basically, because China is not a very positive part, or seen very positively as a part of Russia. So the historical memories are long, and you remember what happened in the medieval times, or pre-medieval times, with invasions from Asia. And now you see Syria, how to try to build some sort of coalition based on fighting terrorism in Syria. But let's not forget, the first Russian bombings did not have IS or Daesh as the prime target. It had the Syria, the other rebels in Syria, the more westernized version. The second part, or the third part of this analysis must take into consideration that it, from Putin's and Kremlin's point of view, it's a tit-for-tat game. If they lie, and the West have been lying to us, if they betray us, and the West have been betraying us, that is very clear, we could lie and we could betray. And notice how the rhetorics on Syria is absolutely parallel to the American rhetorics on Iraq. You didn't care about the United Nations, we don't care about the United Nations. If you don't see this as a multilateral game, we play the bilateral game with you. This is the logic. The fourth is it's a logic of using military power. If the Americans are using military power, it's free for us to use military power. And we couldn't care less about the international order and rule of law on the international scene. We use the power that we have, and we will utilize it. This was seen very clearly 08, with the invasion of Georgia, with the first time that Russia, outside the Warsaw Pact, used military means in order to perceive its policies. And of course this was a very strong signal to not at least this part of the world. Russia wants a world order based on three elements, I would say. The rule or the principle of non-interference in other countries' domestic affairs, primarily Russia's domestic affairs. The absolute respect for the post-Soviet spheres of interest, to a certain extent probably also parts of the former Soviet sphere of interest. And thirdly, no revolutions in order to achieve the change of power. And you can see here a mix of old principles from the Vienna Congress over the Yalta and put Helsinki under the table. Restore the rules of political game that were codified in Yalta. The sphere of interests, position of power between a few global, or I would say partition of power between a few global powers, and in particular the two superpowers. Geopolitics instead of norm and value-based politics. This is a very, very crucial thing for Kremlin. Geopolitics instead of value-based, norm-based policies. This is a core thing here. Ad hoc coalitions instead of the UN, and bargains. Give us Ukraine and we will be happy to be cooperative in the Middle East. So, but make no mistake, this is popular not only in Russia, but in wide circle in Europe as well, as has been said before. The anti-liberal forces have gained momentum not only in Europe, but also in the US. The urbanization of Eastern Europe is very clear. The right-wing radicals in Western Europe you can see, and the rather bizarre debate on foreign policy that we see in the American election campaign right now. So, and this is an important key, because what Putin sees and what Russian elite sees is the West in a declining mood. See the decline of the West. When I had a meeting with one of the strategists in the midst of the financial crisis, the only thing he talked about was the decline of the United States. United States was going down, and United States could not compete with Asia, particularly China, and the development, particularly in China, has weakened the link between freedom and wealth. That is obviously clear. US battles of Iraq, US won the battles of Iraq, but it did not won the politics of Iraq. It was bogged down in the war of terror. It won militarily but lost politically, not only in Iraq but also in Libya. It did not win militarily in Afghanistan. It was more or less even, but it certainly lost the political game. It lost the political game in Egypt, and there is no solution in the Middle East. And from a Russian point of view, I would say Netanyahu probably is stronger in the Congress than the president. This is how Kremlin sees on the US, looks upon the US. If they look upon Europe, they also see a very, very problematic picture from our point of view, and a promising picture from their point of view. So, since the financial crisis broke out in 2006, they have seen what they, in their views, is a declining West. Having said that, the great paradox is that what ultimately drives Putin's policies, in my view, is his own weakness. He's afraid of losing power. And what he saw in Ukraine was the writing on the wall. If this could happen in Kiev, it could also happen in Moscow. And he do not want to lose his power, because if he loses his power, it also loses economic strength. They see Russia as not very strong, but they see their own government as even weaker. And this is what ultimately, I would say, drives the new policies. We must do our analytical homework, and we must see understand Russia better. But we must also be very careful. We must stick with our values and norms. There is no way back from democracy and freedom. And national sovereignty is not only for a few big states, it's for everyone, big and small state. We should not let ourselves play the geopolitical games with the Russians. Our game is the game based on values and norms in international policies. On the global scale, I mean that we should fight with those elements, global elements such as corruption, because when we fight global corruption, we also fight corruption in Russia and countries like Ukraine. And we need to implement the rule of laws in the international politics. I think it's very promising what happens now in the International Athletics Federation. When you say, we don't accept doping, this means that there will be no international games in Russia. Even France was actually on the list. And we need to understand that deterrence is a very, very good defense. And we must invest in our defense capabilities. And the fourth is, of course, the political unity. The EU-European integration and the transatlantic links has never been more important than today since the Second World War. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I make one remark, which I should have made in the beginning, and that I don't only speak for myself. I'm not speaking for the government, not for the moderate party.
But for the Åland Islands, of course. Could I add one thing that I think is important, and you touched upon that, Olof, that is corruption. I think this is one of the real issues. Russia is the most corrupt country in Europe. If you look to the Transparency International, Russia is very corrupt on the level of Nigeria.
I think Ukraine is much more.
Yeah, Ukraine, certainly if you look to the 2014, last year, Ukraine was even more. But what has happened, which I think is rather interesting, that is in Ukraine came the Maidan. That was really the anti-corruption thing, that people revolted against the president who systematically stole from the state. And in Georgia is a country that has moved from a very corrupt level to a level of corruption that perhaps we from Scandinavia would still regard a bit high, but nevertheless well within the scope of the European Union. We have member states in the European Union that have higher corruption than Georgia. A fantastic thing that Georgia did in anti-corruption. And now, of course, in Ukraine, there is a strong drive to fight corruption. Difficult, very difficult,
Yeah.
but nevertheless, Saakashvili, as governor of Odessa, is one of those who are dealing with that. And of course, if you fight corruption, you fight against the whole Putin system.
That's right.
I mean, the power on that, it's built on corruption. And I think that is one of the reasons why he is so afraid of what's called the colored revolutions. In a way, you can say that Maidan was perhaps one of the most positive things that happened during 2014. A fantastic thing that mainly not only young people, but to a great extent young people stayed out there in the darkness in the winter of Kiev, and they got a change. I think in all the doom and gloom that we have, we must also see then that was an enormous achievement, and perhaps the most threatening achievement seen from the Putin regime's point of view. By that, we open the floor for interventions, questions, reflections. Yes, please.
Yes, Magnus Christiansson from the Swedish Defense University. Thank you for nice presentations. We heard that Putin is using the Middle East and the Syria situation for his own geopolitical needs. Would you actually elaborate a little bit more in detail how you see the road ahead, and do you think that Putin will actually succeed in turning the U.S. objectives in the Syria that we see that has been hinted in your presentations?
I think it was you, Olof, who mentioned it, so perhaps you should start. And I invite you all to respond.
Yeah, I think it's obvious that what Putin wants is to have a place with the table, and now he has a place with the table, as was said before. And the perception is, of course, a bit worrisome when we look upon. On the other hand, I think there is no viable solution for Syria with Assad still in power. I can't see that this is absolutely, even theoretically possible. You can't run a country without the people, and people are leaving Syria. It's a massive exodus from Syria. So I think that this is one of the restrictions that the realities are putting on his policies. The second is, of course, I don't think that you will be successful fighting Daesh only with bombs. I think we have seen enough of not very successful bombing campaigns without troops on the ground, boots on the ground. So I think that you need some sort of more powerful military intervention in order to fight Daesh. And how this is going to be sorted out, it's difficult to see, but I'm not sure that Russia can deliver on the ground what they might be able to deliver in the air. So I think that if we are going to have a massive intervention in Syria, then it will be done by others. On the other hand, you have an American election, nothing will happen before that. So it's a very gloomy scenario for the Syrians, and the exodus will go on. But you can also see that people are now voting with their feet. They leave the country when they can't be provided with freedom, liberties, and security. And this means that it's a very good showcase why authoritarianism and repression is not viable any longer in the global world, today's global world.
I would like just to add about Donbass situation. Yes, I think that Syria let Putin quit Donbass. He had no game there, and he was the anti-hero for the whole world there in Donbass. So now he have got another game.
And let me add to this. We had, of course, the huge tragedy with the Russian plane. But I think it's quite a lot of people who thinks also about MH17. And the legal process with MH17 is going on, and it will go on, and it will never, ever be finished before those who are responsible are put on trial. You can be quite sure of that. This will be quite a problem for the Kremlin to deal with in the future.
Stephen?
I would just
Nothing
say,
happens before the next presidential elections. What is your take on that?
well, I think that's a fair point as it relates to the question posed. And that is, some are suggesting, and it's being written already, and you see it in the news, that there's some quid pro quo in the works, possibly, that in exchange for military cooperation in Syria, that somehow some consideration might be given to lifting sanctions against Russia. Again, I don't speak for this administration. I'm on the other side of the aisle, but I think that would be highly unlikely. Congress is very strongly supportive of keeping the sanctions in place on Russia because of its intervention in Ukraine. And I think in a presidential year, it is highly unlikely that those would be lifted. And hopefully you'll see a Republican president who will want to impose even harsher sanctions if he or she is elected. But that's just my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Mats?
Mats Johansson, Stockholm Free World Forum, which is a think tank. What are the Kremlin ambitions for the Baltic states, leaving Syria aside? I think what happens in Syria interests many Swedes, but we are even more eager to preserve our interests for the Baltic states. The main difference is, of course, that these days the Baltic states are members of NATO. But could you please elaborate a bit on what would be the Putin provocations for coming up, especially for when the day after Mrs. Clinton has been elected U.S. president? What would be the surprise in January 17?
Thank you. Olga, you start.
Yes, I would like to start with Baltic countries, and Kremlin and Russian TV are describing Baltic countries as Nazi regimes like Ukraine and like all pro-European former Soviet countries, former Soviet republics. So really, we don't know what Kremlin will done with it. Unpredictability is the main problem of Putin's regime. What will they do after Syria will end? We don't know. It may start to go to Baltic states. Unpredictability, yes. And that is the problem.
Stephen?
Well, again, we have an office in Vilnius. We do a lot of work in all three Baltic countries. The sense that I get from talking to political leaders there and from government representatives is that Russia is utilizing, some of the soft power techniques that I discussed earlier, primarily through media and disinformation. Russian business interests are buying up shares of Lithuanian and other Baltic-owned newspapers, electronic media, trying to influence public opinion that way. We know for a fact that Russian funding is going to certain NGOs in Latvia, supporting Russian cause, defending Russia's actions, and again, the type of disinformation that we see coming from Russia today and other outlets. So primarily it seems to be aimed at media disinformation, again, to create confusion, puzzlement, and disorder among the Baltic countries. But I can tell you from our meetings with government leaders in Lithuania, the perception of a threat is real, and the Baltic countries are preparing and seeking not just military assistance, but other types of assistance from the West that they feel that they badly need.
Olof?
I have an extremely intelligent wife. And she said to me regarding Paris that you can't hinder or stop evil things to happen, but you own the consequences. And I think that is exactly the situation we have with regard to the European Union and NATO, that we can't stop Russia from doing evil things if they do evil things. But what we do is we own the consequences of what is happening now. And it depends on us and our capability to have a strong defense, to use the instruments of deterrence, That is ultimately what is going to be the restrictions for Kremlin with regard to NATO and with regard to the EU. We set up the restrictions. We can block the roads. If we don't, we should not expect others not to use the situation that is there. If there is a vacuum, it will be filled. And our responsibility is to see that there is no vacuum, but there is a strong European and NATO defense for these countries who are members of both the EU and the NATO.
Thank you. I think there was someone there. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Ehrenkrona, I write for the Atlantic Council and other publications on the Ukrainian war. I was wondering a little bit how we ended up here, because Göran, you talked about that a little bit in your introduction. And Anders Åslund, the Swedish economist who worked in Russia in the 90s, he says that one distinctive thing was that in the Eastern European countries, like in Poland, there was immediately a signal that, yes, you can be a member of the EU and the NATO as long as you make all these reforms, and that was a very strong pulling force. Now, in Russia, that never happened. Some liberals in Russia claimed that there were ambitions that we wanted to join the EU, perhaps maybe NATO in the future, but they got the feeling that the door was slammed in their face. Now, of course, having Russia joining EU and NATO is it's a very complicated idea. It's probably, maybe wasn't even possible, but I would wonder to hear your take on this whole, could have that thing been handled differently, and are there some lessons to learn for the future? Not that it excuses anything, obviously, but just like to hear your opinion on that.
Stephen.
Well, glad to hear from the Atlantic Council, and glad to see you here. We work very closely with Ambassador Herbst and Damon Wilson at your organization, Washington, on a number of different joint areas of interest. But Ukraine is an area where we work quite a bit with them, and Anders Åslund as well. To start with the premise of the argument, many people have tried to argue that had Russia been treated differently in the 90s, that somehow we'd not be where we were here today. I tend to refute those arguments. I don't buy into the argument that somehow by the enlargement of NATO, we forced Russia's hand, we forced Russia to take the positions that it's taking today. These were requests from sovereign governments that have the right to choose what alliances they want to enter into. The intention was never to encircle Russia, but to allow these countries who expressed a desire to join and meet the requirements to do so. So I don't buy into the argument that somehow the West is responsible for Putin today cracking down on liberal democracy in his own country, invading other countries, and endangering the political order in Western and Eastern Europe. I don't agree with it.
Have a comment to that, Olga?
No.
Olof?
No, I agree with Stephen. I mean, on the contrary, it was a very, very clear ambition from Western politicians not to create a Versailles syndrome in Russia. We did a lot of things in order to that, and it would have been perfectly feasible to have an economic area going from Ireland to Vladivostok. That would have been perfectly feasible if Russia just has made their domestic reforms that was necessary. But the problem is, and I think that is a very important aspect of this, we have a syndicate in Kremlin. It's not a political party, it's not political ideals, it's a syndicate. And the syndicate works with other incentives than politicians. That is one problem that we have to deal with, because we are all politicians, we deal with political incentives, but there are political incentives and some other incentives that are is ruling Kremlin, and those incentives are we haven't in the U.S. you haven't dealt with them since the late 19th century. Actually, it was Theodore Roosevelt basically who changed the incentives in American politics, and we have the same in very when young democracies in Europe. So I think that is one of the things that we need to think about. How do we deal with the syndicate when it comes to global politics?
And the syndicate is to a great extent former KGB or FSB. That is Putin's party, so to say.
And
As you said,
oil and gas.
And oil and gas, yeah, and use that as an instrument to enrich themselves. Could I add to that don't forget what we did. We enlarged the G70 to G8, getting Russia into that group, not because Russia really earned it, but as a gesture to bring them in. There was a NATO-Russia Council, which was a way of saying from NATO that you are not our enemy any longer. That is still former NATO policy. Russia is not an enemy. And invite them to be part of practically everything. Invite to inspect NATO installations and whatever. I remember myself and the commander-in-chief of the European NATO forces, an American general, invited the Russian delegation with his aircraft to visit all NATO installations in Europe, open to see it. And then, of course, it was serious when the discussions were about Russia coming into NATO. That for the American point of view, that was really serious. That would be better to have them in NATO than outside. And as many senators said, that we are prepared to defend you as well. That perhaps was a bit double-edged seen from the pride of Russia, but nevertheless, that was serious. Going into WTO, going into the Council of Europe. There is a problem with that now because we see that from the inside, the Russian regime is now destroying a lot of these things by obstructing, for example, in the Council of Europe, the OSCE. And I guess, I don't know of WTO, but I guess that they are not one of the liberal forces.
There are
to
some
put it
problems
mildly.
with
Some
sanctions and
exactly.
yeah.
So in a way, it had a cost for us to do it, but there was a systematic will there to bring them into the saloons instead of keeping them outside, even to the price of sometimes accepting that they didn't fulfill the standards, but nevertheless it was more important to have them there. I think the problem that we did from the West was that we had a Russia first policy. That was right first during 1990s. I think that from let us say 2004 or whatever we say is the inflection point, I think we should have the neighboring first. That would be best for them and for Russia. But that never happened until late. Next question. I have it difficult to see that. Yeah, yes, please.
I'm Hans Jeppsson. I just have a brief question about China, because China is the economic superpower. It is now showing its strength in the South China Sea. And what is the China-Russia relation of the future going to be like? Is it going to be an adversary, or are they going to be collaborators?
Maybe Olof?
Olof, you start.
Yeah, it's a conventional. It's a marriage of convenience. I would say. No one loves each other, but they have certain interests that right now is. But I think that China has, of course, the upper hand economically, and I think the agreements that have been done on gas and oil, if they would be, I mean, here you deal with a syndicate. If you think that it's two partners, two governments having a government-to-government deal, then it would probably be rather equal. Here you have a third party inside. The company, for example, the construction companies that were going to build the pipeline. And if you have kickbacks in the system with 40%, then the Russian companies who delivers the gas or whatever, or those who are supposed to be some sort of relationship with the taxpayers, they will probably come out rather bad, while the third party, being private parts of the syndicate, will come out extremely good. But the most profitable business will be done by the Chinese, you can bet. And I think this is, on the micro level, shows rather well the relationship today between China and Russia. China has still is ruled by a political structure and a political elite, and is basically a state that is not interfered that much with there is a lot of corruption in China as well, of course there is, but it is, so to say, it's more politically controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. There is no balance in Kremlin. You look at the former former Soviet Communist Party. I mean, there was a balance between the party and there was corruption, definitely, but there was some sort of political structure. That structure is not there any longer. It's a private, in a sense, it's a very private company.
But with huge territory. I think
Huge
that
territory, and with nukes.
I think that China is more powerful in this contract and will receive more than Russia. And Russia have given some territories from Russia to China, so China now has more than Russia.
Have you any take on that?
I would just a quick comment. If you travel to the Russian Far East and visit the areas that border China, clearly China is winning the economic war. If you go to Khabarovsk, cities like that, you see the market is flooded with Chinese goods. You don't see Russian goods. In Vladivostok, you can go for 3 days without seeing a Russian manufactured automobile. Everything is imported from Asia. So when one starts to lose the economic war, then one starts to be susceptible militarily. And I think that is coming. I think China will not only challenge Russia economically, but in short order will challenge Russia militarily. We've never understood why Putin considers Europe and the United States, the West collectively, as the primary threat to Russia's interests, economically, politically, militarily. In my view, again, this is my personal view, his two key threats come from China and from the North Caucasus, territories within his own country, which we think, because of religion, because of culture, could pose severe threats to Russia's security, especially in light of the events that have unfolded in the last week.
I think we should add that the strategic interest of China is, of course, that Russia does not become European. That is the strategic in long-term interest, because then they would feel themselves. I mean, then you can talk about encirclement.
There are also another difference, I think. First of all, the difference in economic might is enormous. Next year, or perhaps a year after that, China will be 10 times bigger GDP than Russia, if you take it in dollar exchange rate terms. You can discuss whether that's the appropriate, but that is a huge difference. The other is, what I think is that there are also different goals in the two regimes. The Chinese regime has an interest of developing the country and getting that the people should be richer. I don't think that has nothing to do with the Putin regime. They are not interested in the well-being of their own people.
Exactly.
I mean, now in a shrinking economy in Russia, you still go for the military spending, huge military spending from a Russian perspective. And what to cut on? Healthcare, education. According to Anders Åslund, there is not one single kilometer of paved road outside of the city centers since compared with 1991. So you are not interested in developing the country. You are interested in protecting your own regime. And I think that is a very huge thing. China is, I guess, also interested in fighting corruption. Corruption is lower in China than Russia. Doesn't mean it's still high from a European perspective, certainly. But I guess they are serious in that. I myself have been touring China talking about corruption, I can tell you, on an invitation from the Chinese government or leadership. And as far as I understood, they were serious about it. But it's difficult. If you don't have a democratic and open society, it's very difficult to fight corruption, because you need that. More questions? Yes, please.
Frank Belfag, Consilio International. Thank you for these very thought-provoking presentations and comments, which were real food for thought. My impression is that Putin has been building his power base on a contract, on an implicit, tacit contract between the syndicate, to use Olof Ehrenkrona's expression, and Russian public opinion. The contract being, you leave politics to us, and we'll see to it that you get growth, employment, material welfare, salaries, pensions, and so forth. And of course, oil and base gave him the possibilities to hold, for a couple of years, his part of the contract. But now he has difficulties in keeping his part of the contract. And of course, the sanctions were a triggering moment, not as in self. In my view, the sanctions especially triggered the massive capital flight, the stop of foreign direct investments, and the depreciation of the ruble. He now has difficulties economically, and possibly a number of questions domestically could occur. And isn't it, my question to the panel is, isn't that at that moment that the syndicate could become dangerous? Because they've seen after Georgia, after Crimea, after eastern Ukraine, that obviously you can gain in popularity, you can play on the nationalistic strings of public opinion. Isn't that the moment when the danger is there, and that further temptation for foreign adventures, the classical thing, could occur? What are the views of the panel on that one?
Okay,
Olga?
may I start? Yes. I think that Russians right now don't feel such situation. They have the same salaries, and all their problems are explained by Russian TV, that there is the enemies from USA and from Europe, they're against you, and they make you problems. So right now there is no damage for Putin and for his regimes at all. And I don't know when it will change, and how long will Russian TV works so effectively.
Olof?
I agree. I think that what Putin so far has been able to do, or the Kremlin has been able to do, is to create a sense of that they are under siege. The Russian people are under siege from the West. And this is basically boosting his figures of popularity. And but in the long run, I think that it is weakening his power base. And I think that when after 2010 elections, or it was 2010, I think, when the demonstrations were, I think he was really worried about his power.
But not now.
No, not now. I think that he is showing off in front of the Russian public opinion, and so far it's going well. There could be, I mean, I think coming back to what the International Athletics Federation is doing now, I mean, if Russia will not be able to have the World Cup in football, for example, or this could be, I mean... If
Russians won't have any shows, just to see them, to entertain them, that will be a problem.
And if the Russians feel that they are no longer proud of the country, I think that is also an important aspect of this. I'm very confident of the basic sentiment in the Russian people. Basically, they are always victims of their leaders, and have been so for hundreds of years. And this is a problem because they are used to it, which makes them obedient. But I don't think that this can last forever. And a government without ideas, without policies, except providing for their own bank accounts, I would say basically has no future.
Stephen?
I think it was a great question. I agree with you 100% about this contract issue. We talk about this a lot. But I think there are two contracts at play. I think what you're referring to is the agreement, so-called, between Putin and the oligarchs. Stay out of politics, but you'll be allowed to freely continue to prosper with your business enterprises. The second contract is actually what Olga is talking about, is that the contract between Putin and the Russian people, which is basically in return for surrendering certain rights of association, First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, political rights. In exchange for a forfeiture to a certain degree of those rights, the Russian people were promised a certain standard of living, wages, prosperity, and stability. And that's the social contract that he has with the Russian people. It's really, in my view, two separate things. And so that could change. If oil prices remain the same, if the sanctions remain in place, Russia will eventually run out of its cash reserves. That's how it's surviving now. And that's how it's keeping its compact with the Russian people. When the reserves run out, if they run out, then I think public opinion will start to change, because the standard of living, which is already starting to slowly be reduced, over time, I think that could affect and that could promote a sea change. You'll hear more from Ilya about this, about what the opposition thinks in Moscow and St. Petersburg about the prospects, but I think it's a real one.
Could I add that according to Andrei Illarionov, who was the economic advisor to Putin for the first 6 years, he says that about net foreign export of oil and gas, I mean deducting the internal domestic consumption of oil and gas, which is rather huge, 1/3 of the state budget is depending on that, was depending on that before, that is before the mid-2014 when the prices fell. And that is a huge part that has now disappeared because it's the profits out of that. And with low oil and gas prices, of course, the profit is not there any longer. I don't know whether Gazprom is really profitable any longer. There are discussions on that. I don't know what the truth is. So that is a huge take away a huge part of the state ability to deliver. It can still live, of course, on funds that has been accumulated, but they run out rather quick, I would say. The inflation rate is about 14%, so even if you say you have the same salary.
But currency has changed,
Yeah.
so they have enough rubles to pay salaries.
Yeah, but you cannot in the long run pay by inflation.
I think they have some years.
Maybe. We don't know that. But there is a huge blow to the economy of Russia.
And I think
So
that
bread and circus is the circus part of it he can deliver. The bread part of it, perhaps, I don't know, a few years, but then they run out of bread, then it's rather difficult.
But I would advise also you to look at what happens in the fringes of Russia. I mean, the oil prices is a problem for Azerbaijan as well, and for Uzbekistan and for Kazakhstan. So, and it's a destabilizing factor in the whole area. And I think that the most critical area right now is South Caucasus, because the Azeris, for them, it's a real blow with oil prices on this level.
I think my further point was, isn't that at that moment that the syndicate becomes dangerous because they could be tempted
Not now.
to further foreign adventures?
Not now, I think.
Not now. Okay. Could I add, when it comes to Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, they spread the oil wealth much better among the population than Russia. If you go to Azerbaijan and you go to Kazakhstan, you see a lot of new schools, new libraries, even in distant parts of the two countries. They are not present when it comes to democracy, but certainly they've been eager to spread the oil wealth much more than Russia. Russia has done very little on that, which means that in that sense it's a more underdeveloped country, in spite of the huge gains on oil and gas. Yes, you further back there, see a hand.
Alexander Mazurkin from Christian Democratic International Center. I just have a question about Syria. Don't you think that the military operation of Russia in Syria actually has its goal to destabilize conflict and escalate it?
Because if you escalate the conflict in Syria, it means it's escalating refugee crisis, and refugees going to Europe and to European Union, and now it's split. And then the focus is mainly on internal affairs rather than international affairs. And how do you think Russia would use this split in European Union in future? There is possibly a strategy about it. Thank you.
A small question, easy to answer.
Well, in my view, I don't think there is a great conspiracy here. I don't think so. Actually, if I say something positive about Russia, it's the only border to Europe that it's actually still holding, which the Finns are very eager to tell us. So I think that there is the main purpose of Putin's Syrian adventure is that he wants to be invited to the table, and so far this has been successful. And and I don't argue. I think it's. You have to talk to him about Syria, but what you do not have to do, and what you should not do, is to bargain. You should not bargain Ukraine or Crimea with Syria. If you want to be constructive on Syria, you're welcome. Full stop.
There are not only Russian bombings in Syria. Yes, so I don't think that Russian planes have any special role there.
You should also remember that if you go back to 2011, Russia, supported by China, blocked the idea of a no-fly zone, for example. That might have been the best or the least bad, perhaps one should say, when it comes to the Middle East. If there are no good options, they are at least bad. When your boss, Senator McCain, was a driving force, and you can imagine what had happened if the presidential election in November 2008 had been slightly different. But that is history. Bo Hugemark.
Bo Hugemark, Swedish Atlantic Council. Let me go back to the question about the social contract. The social contract in the Soviet times, it was three things: job for all, fixed prices, and equality. Equality. All were equal, but some were more equal than others. But today, somebody are very much unequal. The difference between the low-paid and the stinking rich is conspicuous. Will that reach a point when the people will revolt against it?
Olga, that is for you.
I think that the part of the social contract now was the permanent economic growth. Each year was better than previous one. And that what was made by oil and gas prices. And that's it. And also Russians have an opportunity to go abroad, which is too very important. They can go for their vacations to Turkey, to Egypt, and
Crimea.
That was the part of social contract. It's quite different from the Soviet time. I think that's it.
I think it's a very good question. I think we should remind ourselves, why did Putin come to power? Well, first because he fought the terrorists that bombed Moscow. We all remember that. We don't know exactly who was actually responsible for the bombings of Moscow, but we know that it played a significant role when he came to power. And the other promise he gave was to fight the oligarchs. And of course, there is a potential problems here. If people find out that one of the most prominent oligarchs is actually in Kremlin, on the top of everyone else, that could create a problem of legitimacy with regard to the electorate. And the second is, of course, if terrorism is coming back to Russia because of the policies from Kremlin, which of course was one of the basic reasons why they denied that the accident was not an accident, but actually a terror action. Then it also creates a problem of legitimacy. Well, will Russians go to Egypt after this? I doubt it. And a significant part of the Russians cannot afford to go abroad. I mean, we can see the stream of tourists in Finland and Sweden. It's a big difference compared to the situation 5 years ago. And we have the sanctions for the elite, who is not allowed to go to Nice any longer and to stay at the nice hotels. So there are a number of things here that
They're changing, but
there could be a tipping point somewhere.
yeah.
Anything of that? Mind you that 1.5 years ago, the ruble was 24 öre. Now it's 13.5 öre for a ruble. So it's a huge difference. And of course we see that, or we see it as a lack of Russian tourists at places in Stockholm not least. And that goes throughout the world. So it's quite a huge change seen from that perspective.
Which of course is a problem, should say, because if ordinary Russians go to Sweden and Finland, this is the thing that we should welcome, because we could talk to them about certain things also. Right?
But it happens. But I say there was also, if you go back to the, you remember there was a president of Russia called Medvedev. Nobody remembers him any longer, but he was actually a president of Russia. Even he had a prime minister that everybody thought was the real president of Russia. But during his years, there were a lot of, at least in the elite in Moscow, there were a lot of soul searching about Russia's role. There were think tanks that really focused on the problems of Russia. You can be astonished. I visited some of these think tanks that would say essentially what has been said here about the Russia's future. Very troubled, still with a high oil price, but the lack of openness, the lack of real research, intellectual freedom, I mean, really creativity, all the things that make a country really rich. And there were enormous debates within small circles, but still within the I would say, the top elite in Moscow and St. Petersburg, perhaps even other cities, but usually I only meet with the elite. And these people, of course, must still be very worried. I mean, they still are alive, I guess. They don't say anything, I guess, because that could be dangerous. And I noticed when you are in a conference in Moscow today, it's, you know, you have to say truths in the old Soviet way, very convoluted. I don't necessarily, or something, to start with this phrase. But I think there are certainly intellectual forces in Russia that well understand the situation. Perhaps not powerful at all, but still they have also access to some of the social media.
Some of them left Russia.
Some of them, yes, you are. I spoke at this, what is it, the diplomatic university a year ago, and there was translation between English and Russian, and nobody took Russian. Everybody took English. Some of them have studied, you know, at Harvard, and completely different, completely, and not Soviet. It's rather young, 23, 24 years old. And I asked about the Russian television. They said, no, we don't watch television. We have the social media. We take, you know, that even in such a rather formal setting. I mean, there were perhaps at least one or two from FSB there who took notes. I don't know, but so there are of course I guess a debate under the surface that I think could be rather interesting, even if it's very hard to get to it, because we as foreign agents are of course not invited really to these forms.
I would add to this, what is the responsibility we have? I mean, there are parties within the EPP who do go to St. Petersburg not for dining and wining with Memorial, but with totally different people. And I think that our responsibility is actually to back up the decent Russian opposition, and not to be those who are having nice parties with the Russian syndicate. And I think that is one of the most important things that the moderates and the EPP could do is actually to keep the backbenchers who more or less frequently goes to St. Petersburg for these kind of meetings in a much shorter string that has been done than compared to have been done, what has been done before. Because we see now Olga's friends being persecuted in a way that we haven't seen for many, many decades. And the latest thing was, of course, what happens to Memorial the other week. And I think it's extremely important that we, as democrats and advocates of individual freedom and liberties, actually takes our responsibility in order to support those who should be supported in Russia today, and that we keep the other ones on a certain distance.
Thank you. That will also be the for the next session, that will be the theme. But thank you for that, Olof. I think this is very important. There's still a possibility if you have a question. I don't see any. Yes, please.
My name is Taras Budinsky. I represent Ukrainian embassy in Sweden. So, and I have a question, especially for you, to you, Olga. Well, Ukrainian question used to be the crucial for Russia for lots of years and centuries. And the question is, let's imagine that Putin is not forever. And time flies, and probably sometime these three positional parties you mentioned will take a power in Kremlin in Russia. What will they decide about Crimea and they will have a power? Will they say, okay, Russia is democratic, but Crimea is more Russian than Ukrainian one? Could you?
I can give you my own opinion.
Yes, of course,
Okay?
thank you.
I won't say for all the democratic opposition. I think Ilya will do that. For my opinion, Crimea is a Ukrainian part. Okay.
But what about the position?
As I know,
It cannot be just a simple answer.
Yeah, but it was a simple answer.
for me,
Yeah, exactly.
Crimea is Ukraine.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay, I just...
That goes also for Sweden, I can tell you.
Yeah,
That is
okay.
the official policy of Sweden, unanimously in Parliament.
Thank you. But okay, you know, it's just a short remark about that we in Ukraine now, that, well, Ukraine will never be like Ukraine was before. And Russia also will never be the Russia it was before. Because this situation in Ukraine, Maidan and everything, changed both countries and both nations. So, and also the now Crimea is a crucial point for both countries and for both nations. So, and of course, Crimea will never be the Crimea it was in Ukraine. We made lots of mistakes in politics to Crimea also, in the Ukraine, especially to Crimean Tatars, to the social aspect, etc., etc. But, well, what will be the international status? It's a very important question for future decision-making when after this crisis we'll have to going to the end, okay?
I think that European Union should be one of the leader in this process of returning the Crimea to Ukraine. I don't know how to make it, how to organize it.
We'll get a quick answer now from Stephen on that. How to organize it.
Pan Taras, дуже вам дякую за ваше питання. Thank you, Taras, for your question. I agree with you absolutely. The annexation of Crimea, the invasion of Donbass, has totally transformed Ukraine in its attitudes. We do a lot of polling in your country, as you know. Attitudes towards Russia among the Ukrainian people have changed dramatically. Dramatically. Nothing has united, and I'm not telling you anything, but this is for our Swedish guests. Nothing has united the Ukrainian people more than the events of the last 2 years. And you see it in the polling data. There's a renewed sense of pride in being Ukrainian, a renewed sense of pride in their sovereignty, their freedom, their pro-Western orientation. The data is very clear. Every time we do a poll in Ukraine, the numbers for advocating for EU membership and NATO membership trend up, every single poll. The country's made its decision. It's moving inexorably towards Europe. The only thing that could possibly stop it is Russian and further Russian intervention. So it's been a total transformation. I'll just add completely this. The Kremlin's argument that somehow people in Ukraine felt that they needed Russian protection, Russian speakers needed the protection of Russian authorities. Our polling data totally refutes that. The vast majority of Ukrainians, and including Russian speakers, do not feel that they need any protection from Russia. They want their freedom, they want their sovereignty, they want the right to choose a pro-European orientation. It's an excellent question. Thank you.
Says Stephen Nix, who I guess he's one of the people in the West that knows most about Ukraine. Certainly. You are. Olof?
Well, the legal position is quite clear. Crimea is Ukrainian. That's how it is. We had a similar problem with the Åland Islands, actually, in the early 1920s.
Says the Consul General to Åland Islands.
We backed down when the Finns said, no way, we want to have it. And it was a wise decision by the nations, then United Nations, that it was a part of Finland. And it legally was, and we backed down, and I think that the Swedes are very happy for that, because we have excellent relations with the Finns, better than ever. We have excellent relations with the Åland Islands, and when we did the same operation with Norway in 1905, we got not excellent relations, because with the Norways always, but still very, very good relations with Norwegians. And I think that one of the lessons learned for the stronger part here, in the sense geographically and with regard to population, etc., is that if you back down, you have a good conscience. And a good conscience is a very good thing for a nation to have. That's my recommendation.
Thank you. And this is the only way to sort out relations in a continent where you have fragmented populations. That is more or less for all of Europe. So we cannot have this stupid system that you try to making ethnic or language or whatever unity. We have to build it on nations that are tolerant and open, not building on this stupid idea that you should protect those who speak your language. Imagine that the British should protect all English speaking in the world. That would be a huge undertaking for them, I would say, including us. Okay. Are there any further questions?
Well,
We take one
Jan
more.
says that.
We are here for questions, not for coffee.
So I just would like to ask you a little about Mr. Putin. For to some extent, I found it's more like a one-man show. I mean, he must be a good gambler to some extent. And could you comment about his characteristics, so to say?
Who is prepared to comment on his characteristics?
I don't pretend to know the functions in the mind, the things that go on in the mind of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. I would just go back to what Göran and Olof have already said, is that what seems to drive him is remaining in power. It's first and foremost is to remain in control and remain in power. Everything that he does is predicated on that premise to remain in power.
Have you met Putin?
No, I don't know. You don't know. I know he was in Stockholm actually in the 90s. No, I would say that one should be aware of the fact that he's doing karate. Is it, or is it judo? I think. What is important in that is that you take the power from your opponent and redirect it, and that is what he has been very good at. I think that we should read what he says, and we should listen to what he says, and we should take into what he says. I mean, it's serious. The speeches he gives are serious. The press conferences he gives are serious. We can learn from that. But we should also understand that his power basically is, or his power is based on our reactions very much. If we are doing global politics and international politics, and if we are treating our relationship with Russia and the neighborhood in a good way, then the problem would be very absolutely feasible to solve. But if we don't act rationally, and if we are driven off the road and start to deal with a geopolitical game that we are bad at, then we will have great problems. I don't think that Putin's personality is central here. It's other things that are more important, and I'm not sure that things would be much better tomorrow if he left tomorrow. I mean, there are structures in the Kremlin that are more complicated than that. But I think that we own the consequences. We should remember that.
I would like to add just a few comments about that. We know nothing what is going on inside Kremlin and how decisions are made. We can't understand it. We don't see it. We don't hear from inside the Kremlin. And we can't understand if there are any rational opinions. That is very dangerous.
We have a number of Swedes who have met with Putin once. That was about negotiating back the area of the Swedish embassy in St. Petersburg, when Putin was in the international department under the mayor of St. Petersburg. So that was a negotiation that gone on, and then they negotiated with Putin. They didn't know what will happen later on, though. So that's how it is. By that, thank you. We thank Olga, we thank Stephen, we thank Olof for their presentations and their intervention. And thank you all for all your questions and your interest. By that, we conclude the first session.